The Rio Grande River, which about 6 million people from Colorado to New Mexico to Texas to Mexico rely on as a water source, almost went completely dry this year. This is the riverbed in Albuquerque, New Mexico's largest city, in April earlier this year. And this is the same section of the river today. And here it is again, but completely dry in July of last year. This scene is common along sections of the river south of the city, but the river hasn't gone completely dry in Albuquerque since the 1980s. So what's going on here? How can a river reach record water levels in the spring and then be almost empty by the end of summer?
Just because New Mexico saw a monstrous winter in a typical monsoon this year, water shortages are still expected in the future.
The Rio Grande is at risk of running dry.
I'm standing in an area that is normally underwater. The water flow is about as weak as it's ever been over the past 50 years.
The river is bone dry in some parts along the metro. It's something we haven't witnessed in 25 years.
One of America's longest rivers, the Rio Grande is the largest river in New Mexico, running from its origin in Colorado all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. New Mexico's most populated cities are near the river, and its water fills the state's largest reservoir. About half of the state's population relies on this water source. Throughout the centuries, indigenous, Spanish, Mexican, and American communities have all depended on the Rio Grande and have shaped their societies around it.
These communities that have grown up over 100, 150, 200, 500 years, irrigating and growing food as a way of life.
John Fleck is a prominent water policy expert and author who is widely respected as an authority on the subject of water in the Southwest.
The real problem is the fact that the water supply is shrinking. Generally speaking, water use is going down, even though population is going up. The bottom line is there's just less water in the river.
Although the southwestern U.S. has been going through the worst drought the region has experienced in over 1,200 years, it wasn't too long ago that the Rio Grande was seeing nearly record-high volumes of water. These high water levels occurred in the 1930s and 1940s, and there was even a short stint of similarly high levels in the late 90s. But starting in the early 2000s and continuing until today, besides a few outlier years, the Rio Grande has gradually, but consistently, seen a decrease in water flow.
The key difference between the drought that we're having now and droughts thousands of years ago is it's warmer now. Warm air sucks more moisture out of the trees, out of the river, out of the ground. Simple droughts become mega droughts.
As climate change has continued to make this region warmer over the last 2 decades, spring snowmelt that the river depends on has become inconsistent. This has resulted in less water flowing into the Rio Grande over time. Like several rivers in the Southwest that receive relatively low amounts of rainfall in their arid regions, the Rio Grande gets a large portion of its water from snow that accumulates on the high mountaintops of the western U.S. in the winter, then makes its way to the river after melting in the spring. But as global temperatures rise, this unreliable snowmelt has affected not only New Mexico, but the entire Southwest region. And rising temperatures and decreased snowmelt aren't the only things drying up these rivers. Many of these states have predetermined portions of water promised to them each year through decades-old legal agreements called compacts. These old agreements have caused legal issues between governments, like New Mexico and Texas, as the 2 states argue over how much water each one can take from the Rio Grande.
When there is less water, we have to struggle to make choices about where to put the water. And you have to decide, should we put it in this river? Should we hold it back in dams to send downstream to meet next year's use by downstream users? And it's all those choices that we have to balance that are really, really challenging, because there's not enough water to do all the things that we used to do.
Cities battle a fine line of delivering water guaranteed to their citizens while also meeting compact requirements, which can lead to portions of the river being diverted and leaving the riverbed dry. And when that happens, the Rio Grande can look like this. As the Southwest has seen rising temperatures and falling water levels over the last 2 decades, Albuquerque has also seen the Rio Grande flooding the forests that surround it, causing some people to question whether the historic drought is ending. Not exactly. Just a few years ago in 2019, the Rio Grande saw water levels even higher than this year. This peak was then followed up by a few consecutive years of drought and falling water levels. And it is this instability that is the crux of the problem that faces the whole southwestern U.S. These states allocate large parts of their land and water usage to agriculture, and some of these states saw major population growth in the recent years. This means that more people now rely on a rapidly shrinking water supply. In drought years, cities like Albuquerque resort to pumping groundwater to supplement a dry river, which, if the droughts continue, could result in an aquifer that is depleted faster than it can be recharged.
I'm nervous. The 90s were wet. and the reservoirs were full. And we've reached the point where we can't drain reservoirs anymore. And figuring out how to reduce our water use across the basin has been more challenging than I expected it would be. I'm optimistic, but it's a tempered optimism. We have these enormous challenges, right? There's less water and there are more of us. And my optimism involves human adaptability, but the risks are that the impacts of climate change outpace our adaptive capacity as human communities to adjust to the reality of less water.